Alright, hello, welcome back to the podcast once again, everybody. So, starting off with the bigger players, aluminum. Global aluminum production continues to increase as both global demand for aluminum continues to increase, and also aluminum, mostly from bauxite ore, is plentifully abundant. Aluminum is actually more abundant in the Earth's crust than iron, with global aluminum production this past year having gotten up to around 375 million tons, and that's the aluminum extracted from the bauxite ore. The total weight of actual bauxite ore that was mined up was actually over 1 billion, but the amount of aluminum extracted from that bauxite ore was about 375 million tons or so, having increased almost 4 times over the last 26 or 27 years, since as far back as the USGS data goes, to 1994, back when it was around 100 million tons or just over it. And the primary reason for the increase in production has been the rapid upward rise of China, and now the rapid ongoing upward rise of India, as well as the total conglomeration of all the other smaller non-billion population rising nations. And the main big-time miners of bauxite ore and thus producers of aluminum remain obviously Australia, Brazil, the small nation of Guinea in West Africa, even Jamaica in the Caribbean. That island is basically just a giant mound of bauxite ore sitting in the middle of the sea, similar to how the island of New Caledonia, several hundred miles off the coast of Australia, is basically just a giant mound of nickel sitting in the middle of the ocean. And China, both a big miner and producer and consumer as well. Iron. Global iron production has, for the moment, kind of leveled off, right around or just under 2.5 billion tons, even though several years back in the early 2010s it had gotten as high as about 3.5 billion tons mined per year. However, that was sort of a drastic overshoot of demand, and so curtailment of production from that overshoot, and also China shutting down a lot of its iron mines because of their desire for emissions reduction, caused a massive production drop down to about 2.5 billion tons, which seems to have matched demand pretty well, so it's stayed around 2.5 billion tons. And iron, also like aluminum, for the most part being a non-problem resource. There's plenty, and there's plenty of places that haven't even been touched yet. Some of them are really troubled, like Afghanistan, for example, but there's plenty of iron for the most part. Some big-time miners remaining, to no surprise. Australia, again, China, the US, and Western Russia. Next in line, arguably of importance, is copper, and over the last 26 or 27 years, copper production has grown with demand from about 9 million tons per year up to recently having plateaued for the last few years at about 20 million tons per year. Now, theoretically, this should not be peak copper yet, as long as everything was being pushed forward in terms of mining expansions, operations, and startups of new ones, developing new ore sites. Peak copper should not come until the 2030s, but regardless of production, demand is only going in one direction, as I covered in the recent record copper prices coming soon video that I'll put a link to the top-end comment. But copper demand, because of numerous modern events coming together, is going to be skyrocketing, so this plateauing production is going to be an issue, to say the least. And some of the big-time miners are Chile, the Saudi Arabia of copper. Australia, up there again, to no surprise. They're up there with almost everything, kind of like how the other islands I've talked about are this or that resource just compressed together and thrown as a mound into the middle of the ocean. Australia is like a giant version, except it's everything. Zinc, another important one, especially important for steel, especially for galvanized steels, as well as an alloying component for different things. Zinc actually looks like it may have peak plateaued. It really shouldn't have, not until this decade, but it's actually looking like it might have peaked back in 2012 or so, which is not what would have been expected. It hasn't, decreased that much down from there since then, and it was actually leveling off and just starting to increase again, except for last year, 2020. Global zinc production was growing from about 7 million tons per year in the early 90s up to about 14 million tons in 2012, when it apparently maybe peaked, even though that really shouldn't be its peak. But we'll end up finding out, obviously, and the decrease in production has obviously been the primary reason why global zinc inventories have decreased from over 1 million tons in storage back in the early 2010s down to, they had actually fallen below 100,000 tons in storage. Global lead production did peak back in 2013 at about 5.5 million tons per year, and since then had fallen down to about 4.6 or 4.7, and then because of the events of last year, it took a further drop from that down to like 4.4 or 4.3. Nickel, global nickel production has come from below 1 million tons per year up to 2.5 million tons per year, down below it, and now back up to about 2.5 million tons per year again, with its mining expansion drive being largely driven, obviously, by steel demand from the rising nations, especially from China and India, and now it's sort of starting to hit its maximum capability threshold, and that's inevitably presenting some problems as the whole green energy revolution keeps going, as there's inevitably going to start being a bit of a crunch, a bit of a demand conflict between nickel for steel, which has always been its predominant use, and the growing demand for nickel in lithium-ion batteries. Tin. Global tin production has kind of followed a similar pathway, a similar Twin Peaks pathway over the last number of years, with global tin production having gotten up to about 320 or 330,000 tons per year, and then falling down from that, wobbling around, coming back up to it recently, and now starting to drop down from it again. And the primary big-time tin producers are Indonesia, particularly this one little island off the coast of northwestern Indonesia, or I guess more just northern Indonesia, a bit south of Singapore. A huge chunk of all the world's tin supply comes from just that one island. As again, similar to Jamaica for aluminum, New Caledonia for nickel, this island here is basically just a giant pile of tin ore, and the others being China and Myanmar, or you may call it Burma, which is an issue because Myanmar has kind of had internal problems off and on frequently. Lithium. For global lithium production, you might as well play the game of let's spot the sudden upsurge in EV production. Can you see it? Can you see it, guys? Can you see where EV manufacturing numbers started picking up into millions of vehicles per year? I hope you can notice it. So back in the early 90s, when even for just generic like AA and AAA batteries and stuff like that, just general appliance batteries, lithium ion had just sort of become a thing. Lithium production was not even 10,000 tons per year, and before lithium ion batteries even started picking up, lithium was primarily just used for lithium salts, for some medication, and primarily for use in ceramics. Then its demand started to pick up, and it gradually climbed its way up over 30,000 tons per year, until the EV battery demand was going so high and taking the price up with it that numerous projects were finally started up in those high altitude lithium salt flats up in the Andes Mountains down in South America, especially the extraction operations now going on in the southern portion of that really huge lithium salt flat, the one you can even see from space. So that's where all that extra production is physically coming from, and it's actually fallen a little bit in the past few years, right as EV battery demand for lithium and all of its other metals is now starting to shoot upwards again, especially this year with the startup of manufacturing lines of numerous new EV models, increasing production of already existing EV models, and the beginning production of other types of EV vehicles, not just personal automobiles. Now the manufacturing is starting up for large vehicle replacements, i.e. EV pickup trucks, utility vehicles, delivery vans, and even freight trucks like the Tesla Semi. Titanium production is still going up, having been around 3 million tons per year in the early 90s, now having made it up to over 8 million tons per year. And titanium should not come into any issues soon, at least, not immediately soon. And ironically or unironically enough, most titanium that's mined up is not even used for its metal, in its metal form, or for metallurgical purposes. Most of it is just used as titanium dioxide for white paint. Chromium. Global chromium production, with the increase and upsurge of steel demand from the quickly rising nations, again predominantly China, now India, and the conglomeration of just all the other rising nations. Chromium production globally has come up from between 10 and 15 million tons per year in the early 90s, up to recently as high as 45 million tons. And dropping down to 40 million for 2020 because of 2020 situation-related issues, as well as some South Africa-specific related issues, because about half of the world's chromium supply is mined in South Africa, along with most of the world's platinum group metal supply, and about a quarter of the world's manganese supply. Also have a specific video about that, not so creatively titled The South Africa Problem. But yeah, so last year kind of hit chromium production, as well as some specific stuff happening in South Africa also hit chromium production. And global manganese, one of the other primary constituents of steel, global manganese production followed the same trend as steel demand upsurged from the rising nations, having been around 6 or 7 million tons per year in the early 90s, and having now made it up to around 20, and not as steep of a drop as chromium had, but you can see the drop from last year. Again, most of that was from South Africa disruptions, as South Africa is responsible for about a quarter of the world's manganese supply, and manganese should not otherwise be having immediate concerns, immediate plateaus or peaks. And by immediate, I usually mean within the next decade or two. However, in terms of actual mining extractable availability, manganese is not as abundant as we would like it to be, so it will inevitably be having some issues. Global molybdenum production, molybdenum primarily being a steel alloy component. Again, you can see it follow the same trend as steel demand boomed from rising nations. So it rose up from about 100,000 tons per year in the early 90s up to about 250,000 tons per year as of present day. And it does not primarily come from South Africa, so it did not have a sudden supply dip last year. It kind of has been plateauing or leveling off for the past several years at around 250,000 tons a year, despite constantly increasing demand, so it may be starting to encounter some issues, but it shouldn't be hardcore plateauing or hitting an actual true peak just yet. But like manganese and chromium, it is unfortunately not as abundantly available as aluminum and iron. Vanadium is going to be having issues, especially from supply crunch brought about by demand conflict, as the whole grid storage battery thing keeps sweeping around. Once the realization really strikes that there's not enough nickel for both EV batteries and grid storage batteries, countries and states going after grid storage batteries are going to realize they're going to have to switch over to vanadium redox batteries, and then that's going to cause a demand issue in conflict with the need of vanadium for steel, going up from close to 30,000 tons a year in the early 90s, almost hitting 90,000 tons a year recently, and just starting to drop a little bit, primarily from supply disruptions within South Africa. And vanadium will likely be hitting some supply limit problems sooner rather than later. And like I said, even apart from that, the upcoming supply conflict between vanadium needed for steel, needed for building things and infrastructure, so rising nations can actually rise, versus all the first world nations wanting their bunkers full of grid storage batteries. Niobium, another steel ingredient for various steel alloys, followed the same pattern. Again, in general, granted, it had a stall out and was kind of stuck for a bit, for almost a decade, but around 60,000 tons per year. And recently it has started climbing up from that. However, now it's taken a dive back down. And similar to vanadium, niobium is going to likely be running into some mine production issues in the not too distant future. At least though niobium doesn't have a major demand conflict coming up like vanadium and nickel do. Cobalt has been on the long-term increase as cobalt demand has risen due to increasing demand from rising nations, particularly air travel, and also as they have increased obviously their electricity provision to their citizens, as one of cobalt's primary consumption sources is for nickel superalloys used in aircraft engines and in power generation turbines. And now it is also surging upwards from its use in EV batteries and grid storage batteries, since many of them are still being built as lithium-ion batteries for the moment. So global cobalt production has risen from around 20,000 tons per year back in the early 90s up to almost 150,000 tons recently, and cobalt is going to go in sort of an opposite direction. As opposed to a demand conflict, it's actually going to be having a demand reduction, as many EV manufacturers and assumably grid storage battery manufacturers are shifting themselves over to no cobalt batteries, making lithium-ion batteries that don't include cobalt, to do which they just fill the gap with more nickel, so that's going to cause a nickel issue. But it gets rid of the cobalt problem, as the huge majority of the world's cobalt is mined in the Congo, the larger unstable Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it is mined with child slave labor. So because of that obvious problem, everyone's trying to shift away from cobalt for batteries, and ideally we could get back down to just cobalt demand from nickel-cobalt superalloys, which Australia should mostly be able to mine enough cobalt to supply. Tellurium, a not abundant metal that is required for some types of more efficient solar panels, i.e. the ones that power producers would preferably want to use, and the ones that people in general would want to be using, because solar panels already have a silver demand issue, and so more efficient panels produce more power for the same amount of silver, and reduce the silver supply issue. It wouldn't really help in the end anyways, but still, that's the direction everyone obviously wants to go, is for more efficient solar panels. However, instead of getting rid of the silver supply issue, it is just creating supply issues regarding other metals that are required to make the panels more efficient. One type is for cadmium-tellurium panels, which require tellurium, which is not abundant. And most of the higher efficiency panels also require gallium, which is not majorly abundant. They also require indium, and some of the more stacked layer really high efficiency solar panels require metals that really can't afford demand competition, like germanium. So global tellurium production, only measured in tons, as you can see, jumped up during the 90s as a lot of solar panel installation stuff started taking place, and kind of gradually drifted its way up until you get about midway through the 2010s, once actual major solar power generation facilities started being built in a lot of places. Then demand shot up, so production shot up. However, it cannot chase it forever, and even apart from its limitations in how high it can go, it also has an actual supply issue. But Tellurium, for the moment, in global production, has gone from about 100 tons back in 94 up to just about 500 tons in present day. Indium, just mentioned, also has been going up in production, but will inevitably have issues. Indium has had sort of 3 demand surges or demand waves. The first being from the advent of flat screens for everything, as indium is the primary constituent of indium tin oxide, which is the wonder material that allows the existence of flat screens. Then following that was the advent of LED light bulbs, as indium is one of the material components for many of the different LED diodes. And then now the new surge is the solar power surge, as indium is required in a lot of the types of higher efficiency solar panels. So global indium production, also only measured in tons, has managed to be brought up from under 200 tons per year back in the early 90s up to almost 1,000 tons per year recently. Now, as of the events of last year, it's fallen down a bit, closer to 900. Now for the precious metals and platinum group metals. The platinum group metals primarily are supplied by South Africa, as I mentioned, and platinum production globally, aka from South Africa, has basically been stuck at around 200 tons roughly per year for a decade and a half. And over the last few years, it has actually started a new session of tumbling down. And this plateau occurring as platinum group metal demand kept increasing, and now this tumbling down towards 150 over the last several years, occurring right as platinum group metal demand is starting to really uptick pretty quickly from numerous countries, now the big one, China, joining in, implementing really stringent vehicle emission standards, thus requiring more thorough catalytic converters, which, to be more thorough, they require more platinum group metals. And platinum's best buddy, palladium, also has been at a roughly 200 ton per year plateau for the last decade and a half or so. And palladium, for the same reasons as platinum, palladium demand is going up, and supply is not, and won't really be. So it's going to be a fun price scenario. Global silver production, as we mentioned frequently in many episodes, peaked back in 2015 or so, and since then has now fallen by between 10 and 20%. And this all coming as silver demand is going way up, especially from, obviously, the big driver being solar panels. However, also new demand sources are beginning to emerge for silver, like they want to start including silver in EV batteries now. But overall, silver should in general keep going down. I expect it should have a pattern or a number of stops and slight bumps or rebounds, and then fall again, stop and rebound a bit, fall again. But silver in general is on the downward slope. Gold has just recently most likely peaked. It peaked a bit above 3,500 tons per year and has since begun a gradual downward slope. The circumstances of last year kind of accelerated that a little bit, but otherwise it most likely would have stayed at a gradual decline. But this is most likely the peak for gold in total. It is around when it was loosely expected to be, and it is around at least the area or the number range that I in particular was expecting it to probably peak around. And gold is a critical material for electronics, However, thankfully, it's not needed in gargantuan numbers for, important industrial demand sources the way silver is. The majority of gold's demand is still just from jewelry and from investors. Tungsten, again, usually a steel alloying component, especially for hard tool steels and really abrasive steels, especially for heavy cutting or drilling or digging machinery. Tungsten followed basically the same production demand upsurge as most of the other steel additives. It did have a sudden drop in the mid-2000s, but after that it resumed climbing upwards until around the mid-2010s, since which it has kind of leveled off between 80 and 90,000 tons a year. Antimony mostly peaked back in 2008 at about just under 200,000 tons a year, and since then has really gradually, in terms of its overall trend, slipped down to about 150,000. And there is enough to potentially sort of stall it here and hold it at this level for a little while. However, that would require the effort being put in to do so, and it doesn't, at least initially, look like that's being done. So antimony supply is gradually slipping down. Meanwhile, antimony demand has suddenly picked back up. Germanium, also only measured in tons, like some of the others, has potentially peaked back in 2013 or 2014 at not even 200 tons, at a bit above 160, and is starting to have supply issues despite the demand drive completely being there to push it up if it was entirely demand driven, as germanium itself is already really not abundant, and its demand is going up and up, especially nowadays from the upsurge in solar panel installations for power generation and continued spreading of internet access around the world in greater and greater capacity, as germanium is the key dopant material for fiber optic cables, those things that allow the internet and modern instantaneous communication to exist. So now, with all of that expansion for rising nations, and with all of the mega broadband data expansions and 5G network expansions starting up and ongoing in first world nations, germanium demand is double surging. Gallium, not abundant, also only measured in tons. You can see it was only down around 50 tons per year up until the late 2000s, when, guess what came? The LED lighting revolution. And you can really see that. And then it slipped a bit, came back up again, and started decreasing again, even though its demand has only kept going up, especially now from all of the solar panel installations. So gallium production, again, if it were something abundant and primarily only demand-driven, gallium should really be still increasing in production, but it ain't, because it is, unfortunately, not really abundant. And for rare earths in general, the USGS, for its numbers, the USGS kind of, for different groups of metals, it will single out some of, the more really important ones, and then keep the rest of them all just thrown together. But you can see the sudden upsurge in the late 2010s, and even though the demand upsurge started before that, it took a while. It took a while for that capacity to come online, sort of. And apart from that, it had only been gradually increasing for the last 20 prior years up to that point. So this sudden upsurge is primarily from demand coming about from the massive increase in EV manufacturing and renewable energy installation. And as you can see from the curve, despite the demand still soaring upwards, the supply is already starting to curve itself out. And similar to many of the metals and their dependency on South Africa, most of the rare earth supply is primarily coming out of China. Yttrium, which got its own section, saw its demand upsurge with the beginning of the advent of LEDs, as that's one of its primary consumption sources. Before that, that sort of basement demand level down there of a bit above 2,000 tons per year, that was primarily from its other big demand source, which is for the ceramic refractory coating on the inside of the combustion chambers of aircraft engines. So as LED light bulbs started to come about, yttrium production jumped up in response to the demand. Magnesium is a really fascinating one to follow. Magnesium production grew from around 3 million tons a year in the early 90s, gradually up towards 10 million tons a year, and then, just at the end of the early 2010s, it upsurged enormously, over 25 million tons a year, as China brought into production this massive magnesium supply area. It's somewhere out in the west of China, I believe, but China brought that into production and way upsurged the global supply numbers, well beyond where demand even remotely was. So they kind of had to stop and have even had to start bringing it down because no one was even asking for that much magnesium. Global sulfur production has gradually climbed up over the years. Primarily, most of it is obtained as a byproduct from refining oil and gas. There is some mining of various types of sulfate and sulfurous minerals, but the huge majority is obtained just as a free byproduct from refining oil and gas. And global sulfur production has climbed from about 50 million tons a year up to about 80, where it has plateaued for a number of years, after previously having plateaued at around 70 for a number of years as well. And the amount of sulfur actually being officially extracted, primarily being demand-driven, and sulfur in general will have really next to no supply issues, even outside of oil and gas and coal, as sulfur, even specifically in concentrated amounts in the general crust, is really abundant. Even outside of oil and gas and coal, there's at least a few 100 billion tons of sulfur that's mineable. Similarly tied to oil and gas production, specifically more natural gas production, is global helium production. Helium is not abundant and is coming into a supply issue already, and is going to be heading into worse and worse supply issues as time goes on. Measured in million cubic meters per year, helium production has roughly gone up from about 100 million cubic meters a year up to roughly 180 or so, then fallen down towards 160. Had a steeper drop this past year because of the oil and gas production losses, but would otherwise be on a plateau, and as mentioned is gradually coming into a supply issue, as it is basically entirely tied to natural gas production. That's where the greatest concentrations of it are. There's next to none of it in the atmosphere. Soda ash, or sodium carbonate, an industrial mineral used in a number of different industrial chemical processes, as well as its predominant source of demand, consuming roughly half of it per year, is the making of glass, as the modern glass that we use is what now allows us to have perfectly flat, perfectly transparent glass. And soda ash is decently abundant, so it's not really going to run into any supply issues anytime soon. And also it can be fabricated, it can be chemically synthesized. Granted, that process is decently more expensive than just digging it up. So global soda ash mine production has increased over the last 25 years or so from about 10 million tons per year up to about 16 million tons per year. However, because of last year, it slipped down due to reduced demand from halted construction and especially from reduced vehicle manufacturing, as both of those obviously reduced glass demand worldwide. Limestone, the source of lime, otherwise known as calcium carbonate. Limestone, also one of the key ingredients, or rather the other key ingredient in soda lime glass, as well as being used as the chemical source of lime for numerous industrial processes, as well as also being needed for cement and concrete and other construction material. Limestone was kind of stuck a bit above 100 million tons a year up until some new major stuff came online in the mid-2000s and brought it up over a quarter billion. And since then it has meandered its way up to over 400 million tons per year, getting up close to 450 a few times. Limestone shouldn't be running into any hardcore supply issues, but it's not going to be able to keep remaining infinitely abundant. However, we can, in a way, sort of create artificial limestone through a mix of seawater and CO2 and CO from carbon capture, if we were to do that from coal-fired power plants per se. But sadly, we're not going down the wiser CCS path, or even at least the nuclear and geothermal path. Instead, the world is completely bent on solar and wind, which are the worst possible options, and this is really going to end badly. Our primary mineral source of potassium has gradually increased its production with demand over the years as global population has increased, thus global food demand obviously has increased. Thus, fertilizer need for crops has increased to grow more crops more quickly, but global potash production has gone up from a bit over 20 million tons per year up to just under 40, with again its primary thing being to supply potassium fertilizer, and the overwhelming majority of it is mined up from underneath southern central Canada, for once a friendly and stable nation. And the other major fertilizer mineral, phosphate rock, has for the most part increased with the population going up from around 128 million tons per year back in the early 90s, getting up to almost 270 recently. However, now it has been slipping down, which is, one, not good. Two, peak phosphorus is a thing. This almost certainly isn't it. That's not likely coming until the 2030s either, but that's going to be a problem. Now, there have been proposed projects, particularly, at least they would be most beneficial in huge population areas like megacities for recovery of elemental phosphorus from sewage. However, obviously, those would be really energy-intensive processes, sort of like, desert states and desert nations turning to desalination plants for their water supply. Now for the last few things, one of them being industrial-grade sand, the sand primarily needed and used for concrete. Industrial-grade sand was increasing as construction kept increasing, and industrial-grade sand mining production got all the way up to over 1.4 billion tons per year. However, then as the construction stalled and the economic crisis of the later 2000s took place, kind of plummeted down to around or a bit under 1 billion, and since then it has gradually been climbing its way back up to where it was before, now having gotten up to 1.3 billion tons per year, but the circumstances of last year obviously causing a drop. And industrial grade sand isn't rare per se, it's just we'll say troubled. It's a troubled resource. A very, very necessary, very, very critical resource, but unfortunately a growingly troubled resource. Fluorspar, one of my favorite minerals and the one from which we get our fluorine or fluoride. Fluorspar production has increased over the years from around 4 million tons per year up to about 7.5 or so most recently. With the big consumers of fluorine or fluoride, despite everyone's mind instantly jumping to toothpaste, the big, huge consuming sources of it are obviously industrial, the primary ones being glass making, and the two really big ones being steel production and aluminum refining in the process of actually extracting aluminum out of the bauxite ore that it occurs in. General sort of just miscellaneous stone used in construction, concrete and stuff. General stone mine production had gotten up to 1.7 billion tons per year by the time of the construction slowdown and economic crash of the late 2000s. So then it plunged to a bit below 1.2 billion. So unlike sand, it stayed above 1 billion. And since then it's gradually been climbing back up, and it got back up to 1.5 billion tons, and then slipped down, obviously, over the course of the last year with halted construction and stuff because of the 2020 situation. Salt, regular salt, sodium chloride. Global salt production has gradually increased from the early 90s at around 180 million tons a year, up to getting close to 300 million tons recently, however stalling out before hitting 290 and kind of now slipping down to 270. Instead of extracting it from seawater, we primarily mine salt, as there are quite some thick salt layers deep under a number of places around the world. One of the most famous is the Great Lakes region of Canada and the US. And again, something comes to mind first. For salt, it would be food. That is not the primary consumption source in terms of global demand. It is actually for road salt, for melting ice and snow in the winter, at least for temperate climate regions where the winters don't get all that cold. But road salt is one of salt's primary consumption sources, and the other being just industrial in general to create all kinds of different things that get used in different things that we used, or get used to make different things that we use. And even the ocean water thing aside, even in just mining, concentrations of salt underground on land, there is plenty of salt. There's no salt issue. And finally, we'll end it with clay. Clay kind of just sort of follows long-term construction waves. So primarily on the visible data, it's had two, with its production jumping from around 40 million tons a year up to close to 70, gradually slipping back down. Then once the 2010s got rolling, it started gradually taking its way back up again, and has now gone back up over 60 million tons a year, with clay being used to make a number of things, obviously bricks, but also most types of ceramic, remember. So also tiles, toilets, sinks, showers, bathtubs. And in terms of supply and abundance, clay it's fine. There's plenty of clay. Kind of like industrial grade sand, it might inevitably have some non-abundance related issues revolving around getting it, but in general it'll be fine. Alright, thankfully for my voice, that is it for what we're gonna go through this time. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. If you would like to support me or help me out, and only if you actually can, obviously, then PayPal and Patreon links are also both down there with the other video links I mentioned. But may God, our Father in heaven, protect and bless all of you, and I will see you all around next time.